February 18th, 1943. The German military chef stood frozen as the American sergeant placed before him something he hadn't seen in 18 months. A real egg. Not powdered, not ersatz, but a genuine fresh American egg. When it cracked open, the yolk ran golden yellow, and Heinrich Adler, faithful Nazi soldier, for 3 years did something that shocked everyone in the mess hall. He wept. The morning sun cut through the Texas camp window at a low angle, illuminating particles of flour dust that hung in the air like snow. The light caught the edge of the white porcelain plate, making it glow against the dark wood of the table. Heinrich's hands trembled as they hovered over the egg, unable to touch it, as if it might vanish like a mirage in the North African desert he'd left behind. The sergeant who'd served him breakfast stood a respectful distance away, clipboard tucked under one arm, watching this 37-year-old prisoner of war struggle with the simple act of eating. Around them, the mess hall buzzed with the ordinary chaos of morning. American soldiers shuffling through the line, the clatter of metal trays, the smell of bacon frying on industrial griddles, and the sound that Heinrich couldn't quite process. Laughter. Men laughing over breakfast as if war was something that happened somewhere else to someone else. But this breakfast wasn't kindness. It was part of a calculated plan that would transform 1,283 German prisoners and accidentally change post-war Germany forever. The Americans weren't just feeding these men. They were conducting the most successful re-education program in history, and it all started with bacon. In the next hour, you'll discover how prisoner of war cooks became teachers of democracy, why Klaus the hardcore Nazi broke down after one hospital visit, the 212-page notebook that rebuilt Germany's food industry, and the cowboy from Texas who changed the Cold War. Heinrich Adler came from Munich, that ancient Bavarian city of beer gardens and church spires. In 1935, at 29 years old, he was an apprentice at the Königshof Hotel, learning the old ways of German baking under masters who'd learned from their masters before them. He was good with his hands, patient with dough, precise with measurements, the kind of craftsman who understood that bread was more than flour and water. It was tradition made edible. He had a wife named Martha, 30 years old, with dark hair she wore pinned up in the fashion of the time, and a daughter named Sophie, 5 years old, who loved to stand on a chair in their small kitchen and help him knead dough for Sunday bread. Their apartment was on the third floor of a building near the Viktualienmarkt, the old market district where you could smell roasting chestnuts in winter and fresh strawberries in summer. In October of 1940, British bombers came in the night. When Heinrich returned from his shift at the hotel, the building was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Reduced to a smoking crater and a pile of bricks that used to be someone's home. Someone's life. His life. He carried something in his pocket every day after that. A photograph. The three of them at the English Garden in the summer of '39, before the world caught fire. Sophie feeding ducks. Martha smiling at the camera. Heinrich with his arm around his wife, squinting in the sun. He would look at that photograph only once each day, always in private, always in silence. What was in that photo would later explain why he made the choice that saved his life. Grief does strange things to a man's mind. It can sharpen him into something hard and useful, or it can hollow him out entirely. For Heinrich, it did both. In 1941, he joined the Wehrmacht Kitchen Corps, not because he believed in conquest, not even because he believed in the party, though he'd said the words and raised his arm with the rest of them. He joined to feed the heroes. That's what they called soldiers then. Heroes. Men who would avenge his family. Men who would make England pay. The propaganda was everywhere in those days. Radio broadcasts promising swift victory. Newspapers showing German soldiers marching through Paris, through Warsaw, through everywhere. And always the same message. German organization. German efficiency. German superiority over the chaotic, mongrel Americans who didn't understand discipline or order or sacrifice. Heinrich believed it because he needed to believe something. When you lose everything, certainty feels like oxygen. By 1943, he'd cooked with sawdust mixed into flour to make it stretch. He'd made soup from sand and water because it was the only way to give 200 men something hot to put in their bellies. He'd watched rations shrink week after week, month after month, until the daily meal was a joke. A cruel parody of food. 240 calories of watery broth and bread so hard you could break teeth on it. The Africa Corps was dying. Not from British bullets, though those took their share. They were dying from hunger, from thirst, from the simple mathematical reality that an army cannot fight when it cannot eat. On a cold morning in February, with the sun barely risen over the Tunisian desert, Heinrich and his unit surrendered. They'd been surrounded for 3 days. No supplies, no ammunition, no hope. When the American soldiers approached with rifles ready, Heinrich expected execution. He'd been told Americans took no prisoners, that they were savages who showed no mercy. Instead, he got a job interview. The American processing officer was a lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 25, with a sunburn across his nose and a Midwest accent Heinrich couldn't quite place. The lieutenant sat across a folding table in a tent that smelled of canvas and diesel fuel, filling out forms in triplicate with a fountain pen. "What did you do before the war?" Heinrich didn't understand the question at first. The translator, a German-American private from Milwaukee, repeated it slowly. "I was a baker. 12 years experience. Königshof Hotel in Munich." The lieutenant wrote this down without looking up. "Culinary specialist," that's what the form called it. 12 years experience. He stamped something official looking and nodded to the guard. "You'll be processed at the main facility. Medical exam. Delousing. Assignment." Assignment, Heinrich thought. Don't they realize I'm the enemy? The truck ride to the processing center took 6 hours, bouncing over roads that barely deserved the name. Heinrich sat in the back with 40 other German prisoners, all of them silent, all of them trying to understand what came next. They'd been given water, real water, clean and cold, in canteens that the Americans didn't even bother to collect back. Through the canvas flaps at the rear of the truck, Heinrich watched the desert give way to scrubland, then to actual trees, then to farmland that looked impossibly green after months of sand. At the processing center, they were lined up for medical inspection. A doctor who spoke no German but had kind eyes checked Heinrich's weight, 142 pounds. He'd lost 28 pounds since leaving Germany. The doctor frowned at his clipboard and wrote something down. "We'll get you healthy again," the Milwaukee private said, relaying the doctor's words. Why, Heinrich wanted to ask. Why does the enemy care if I'm healthy? But he was too tired to form the words, too numb to care. He shuffled through the rest of processing in a daze. New uniform, gray with POWs stenciled on the back. Prisoner of war, assignment to Barracks 7, a cot with an actual mattress, thin but clean, and a meal card with instructions in German and English. Report to mess hall at 0600 hours for breakfast. That night, lying on his cot in the darkness, listening to 40 men breathe in their sleep, Heinrich thought about Martha and Sophie. He thought about the photograph in his pocket. And he thought about the fact that tomorrow, for the first time in 18 months, he would eat breakfast. Real breakfast. The Americans had promised. He didn't believe them. February 18th arrived with that particular quality of Texas light that seems to come from everywhere at once. Clean, harsh, honest. Heinrich woke at 5:30, years of military routine, making sleep past dawn impossible. Around him, men stirred. Some prayed, some stared at the ceiling. All of them were thinking the same thing. What happens now? The walk to the mess hall took them across a compound that looked nothing like the prison camps Heinrich had imagined. No barbed wire, or rather barbed wire that seemed almost decorative. Guard towers, but guards who looked bored rather than menacing. Barracks that were plain but solid. And everywhere the smell of cooking food. Real food. The mess hall was a long wooden building with screens instead of glass windows, letting in the morning breeze. Heinrich stepped through the door and stopped. Stopped so suddenly that the man behind him bumped into his back and muttered an apology in German. Stainless steel. That was the first thing he saw. Stainless steel work surfaces that gleamed under fluorescent lights. Stainless steel serving trays arranged in a line. Stainless steel coffee urns, each one tall as a man, with steam rising from the tops. The smell hit him next. Fresh bread. Not the ersatz rye bread made from sawdust and shame, but actual bread with flour that had never seen a substitute. And bacon. God in heaven, bacon frying on griddles, the fat popping and hissing, filling the air with a smell Heinrich had forgotten existed. The line moved, men shuffling forward with metal trays, each one receiving portions from American soldiers who served without comment, without judgment, without anything but the mechanical efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Heinrich reached the first station. Eggs. The cook, an American private who couldn't have been older than 20, cracked 2 eggs onto the griddle in front of him. Not powdered eggs reconstituted with water, not eggs saved for officers only. 2 fresh eggs with yolks so yellow they look painted. Over easy or scrambled? The private asked. The Milwaukee private beside the line repeated the question in German, as if it mattered, as if a prisoner got to choose. Over easy, Heinrich said, his voice barely a whisper. The eggs slid onto his plate. 2 perfect circles of white with golden centers that trembled when the plate moved. Heinrich stared at them, just stared, because the last time he'd seen a real egg was Christmas of 1941, and that had been on an officer's plate, not his. Next station, bacon, 4 strips thick-cut crispy at the edges. The American soldier, serving, didn't ask, just placed them on the plate with tongs and nodded toward the next station. Toast, 2 slices of white bread, soft and warm with real butter on the side. Not margarine, butter. Coffee. The American private manning the urn filled Heinrich's cup without measuring, without rationing, just filled it to the rim and moved on to the next man. Heinrich carried his tray to an empty table and sat down. Around him, other German prisoners were doing the same, some eating quickly as if the food might be taken away, others eating slowly, savoring each bite, a few like Heinrich just staring at their plates as if they contained impossible things. The bacon called to him. He picked up 1 strip, feeling the grease on his fingers, and took a bite. The salt and fat and smoke hit his tongue, and he closed his eyes. He'd forgotten what real food tasted like, forgotten that food could be something other than fuel to keep you alive another day. He took another bite, then another. He couldn't stop himself. 18 months of hunger make a man animal-like in his need. He ate the bacon, all 4 strips, then the eggs, cutting into them with his fork and watching the yolk run golden across the white plate, then the toast, the butter melting into the warm bread. When his plate was empty, he sat there holding his fork, staring at the smears of egg yolk, at the crumbs of toast, at the evidence that this had been real and not some fever dream of a starving man. And that's when it hit him. Not the food itself, but what the food meant. 3,400 calories. That's what the translator had told them last night. Every man in this camp, prisoner or guard, private or general, gets the same ration. 3,400 calories per day. The German army in North Africa had been rationing 2,000 calories, and that was for frontline troops. Support staff got less. Heinrich stood up. The metal chair scraped against the concrete floor loud enough that men at nearby tables looked over. He walked to where the American sergeant stood with his clipboard supervising the breakfast service. The sergeant was older, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and sergeant stripes on his sleeve. His name tag read Hayes. "Excuse me, sir," Heinrich said in German, waiting for translation. "This is officer food. I cannot accept it." The sergeant looked at him. Really looked at him. Not with anger or contempt, but with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "Sit down and eat," Hayes said, his words coming through the translator a moment later. In America, bacon is bacon. Heinrich wanted to argue, wanted to explain that this violated every rule he understood about hierarchy and rank and the proper order of things. But Hayes had already turned back to his clipboard, the conversation over. Heinrich returned to his table. The American flag hung on the wall behind the serving line, 48 stars, on a blue field, red and white stripes. He would see that flag every morning at breakfast, every day for the next 3 years. And each time he would remember this moment, the moment when an American sergeant told him that bacon was just bacon. 20 years later, in 1963, Heinrich would stand in this same Texas town, but this time as an honored guest. The mayor would hand him a key to the city, but in February of 1943, he was just prisoner number 254,891. And he had no idea that his first meal as a prisoner of war would shatter everything he believed. The man sitting next to Heinrich at breakfast was named Franz Bergmann, 33 years old, from Bavaria, with the thick hands of someone who'd worked with dough his entire life. Franz was already on his second helping of eggs when Heinrich sat back down. "They feed us this way because they can," Franz said quietly in German, not looking up from his plate. "That's power, Heinrich. Real power. Not tanks, not bombs. The ability to feed your enemy the same as you feed yourself. Franz came from a family of bakers, 3 generations. His grandfather had opposed the Nazis from the beginning, quietly the way a baker can oppose a government, by refusing to put up the posters, by serving Jewish customers, when others wouldn't, by doing nothing heroic but also nothing shameful. Franz had been conscripted in 1941, didn't volunteer like Heinrich, didn't believe the promises, just went because they'd shoot you if you didn't. You're thinking too much, Franz said, finally looking at Heinrich. Eat. Tomorrow they might change their minds. But they didn't change their minds. The next morning, breakfast was the same. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and the morning after that, and the one after that. By the fourth day, some of the German prisoners stopped looking shocked. By the first week, they started to expect it. Heinrich kept a notebook, a small leather-bound thing he'd carried since Munich, meant for recipes and measurements. Most of the pages were filled with wartime scribbling. How to make 200 portions of soup from one ham bone. How to stretch flour with sawdust without making men sick. Survival cooking, not the craft he'd learned at the Königshof. On the 9th day, he started writing again. But different now. He wrote down everything about the American breakfast. The portion sizes, the consistency, the fact that every single egg was fresh. Every single strip of bacon was real meat. Every single cup of coffee came from real beans, not roasted grain or chicory. 3,400 calories, he wrote in German, his handwriting cramped and precise. Every man, every day, no exceptions. He underlined that last part twice. But not every German prisoner accepted American hospitality. In Barracks 7, a man named Klaus Reinhardt was organizing resistance, and his first target was Heinrich Adler. Klaus was 41 years old, from Hamburg, with the bearing of a career soldier and the cold eyes of a true believer. He'd been an SS kitchen officer, which meant he'd cooked for the elite, the racially pure, the chosen ones who were building the 1,000-year Reich. Klaus didn't surrender because he'd lost faith. He surrendered because he'd run out of bullets. On the 8th evening, after the prisoners returned from their first work detail sorting supplies in the warehouse, Klaus called a meeting in the corner of the barracks farthest from the guards. 24 German cooks gathered in a loose circle. These were the men identified by the Americans as having culinary experience. These were the men who would soon be offered positions in the camp kitchens. Klaus stood in the center, his voice low but firm. "Gentlemen," he said in German, "we must refuse to cook for the enemy. This is not a request. This is a matter of honor, of loyalty, of everything we swore to defend." Some men nodded, others looked at the floor. A few glanced at Heinrich, who stood at the edge of the circle with his arms crossed. "They feed us well," someone said. A young cook from Berlin named Otto. "They treat us fairly. Why should we refuse? Because we are soldiers of the Reich," Klaus said, his voice rising slightly. "Because we do not collaborate with the enemy. Because the moment we put on their aprons and serve their food, we become traitors." 15 men agreed with Klaus. 9 were uncertain, and Heinrich said nothing. "You're the senior chef here," Klaus said, turning to face Heinrich directly. "You trained at the Königshof. Men respect you. Lead us in this refusal." The barracks went quiet, 40 men in their bunks pretending to sleep, or read, all listening to see what Heinrich would say. Heinrich thought about Martha and Sophie. He thought about the photograph in his pocket. He thought about 18 months of cooking with sand and sawdust and watching men grow thin as ghosts. And he thought about this morning's breakfast. 4 strips of bacon, 2 eggs, real coffee. "I will cook," Heinrich said. 3 words. That's all it took. Klaus's face went red. "You're a traitor to Germany." "I'm a chef," Heinrich said calmly. "Chefs cook. That's not treason. That's profession." The group split that night. 15 men sided with Heinrich, accepting positions in the kitchen. 9 sided with Klaus, refusing to participate. The Americans responded to Klaus's group with something that confused everyone. They did nothing. No punishment, no beatings, no starvation rations. Klaus and his men were simply moved to a separate barracks. They received the same food, the same treatment, the same generous portions Heinrich had been shocked by weeks ago. They just ate alone. Klaus expected punishment, expected torture or forced labor or the cruel creativity of captors dealing with defiance. Instead, the Americans simply let him be. And somehow that was more confusing than torture would have been. How do you resist an enemy who doesn't fight back? That night, Heinrich lay on his cot and wrote in his notebook. Just one line before sleep took him. Today I chose between loyalty to a dead idea and loyalty to life itself. I chose life. God forgive me if I chose wrong. The next morning, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper called Heinrich into the mess hall supervisor's office. Cooper was 34 years old from Nebraska, with the weathered face of a farmer's son and the patient eyes of a teacher. He'd been managing mess operations for 2 years, feeding thousands of men 3 times a day, with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that an army marches on its stomach. The office was small, just a desk and 2 chairs and filing cabinets full of requisition forms. Cooper gestured for Heinrich to sit. "I hear you're a baker," Cooper said through translation. 12 years at a good hotel." "Yes, sir," Heinrich said. Cooper stood up. "Let me show you where you'll work." They walked through the serving area, empty now, between meals and into the kitchen beyond. Heinrich stepped through the door and stopped. Stopped so completely that he might have been a photograph instead of a man. Mixers, industrial mixers with 200-pound capacity, their metal bowls gleaming under overhead lights. Heinrich had kneaded dough by hand for 15 years. His forearms were thick as fence posts from the daily labor of feeding his unit. And here were machines that could do in minutes what took him hours. Cooper demonstrated one pressing a button. The mixer hummed to life, the dough hook rotating with a mechanical perfection. "This is for one regiment," Heinrich asked, his voice barely audible. "One meal service," Cooper corrected. "We have 3 of them." They walked to the next station. A walk-in refrigerator, the compressor humming steadily, cold air whooshing out when Cooper opened the heavy door. Inside, meat hung on hooks. Real beef for 200 meals kept at exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell hit Heinrich. Fresh meat, not spoiled, not questionable. Fresh beef with no hint of decay. He reached out and touched one of the hanging sides, feeling the cold, firm flesh under his fingers. "Gott im Himmel," he whispered in German. "This is impossible." Franz, who'd been allowed to come along, stood beside him in the refrigerator, both of them staring at abundance they couldn't quite process. The ovens came next. Convection ovens that could bake 400 loaves at once, with timers that let you set and forget. No need to watch the fire or adjust the heat or stay up all night tending the bake. Cooper showed Heinrich the timer mechanism, explaining through the young private's translation how it worked. "Set it and forget it," Cooper said. Heinrich thought about 15-hour baking shifts in field kitchens. Thought about burns on his forearms from makeshift ovens. Thought about bread that came out raw in the center because the fire died or overcooked to char, because nobody could watch it every minute. "This changes everything," Heinrich said, more to himself than to Cooper. "That's the idea," Cooper replied. They stood there in the kitchen, American lieutenant and German prisoner, looking at machines that represented 2 different philosophies of war. One that starved its army to feed the machine, and one that fed its army to win the war. "You'll start tomorrow," Cooper said. "Training on the equipment. Then full duty in 2 weeks. Heinrich nodded. He had no words. That evening, while Heinrich marveled at machinery, Klaus Reinhardt sat in his barracks writing a letter he knew would never be sent. The guards collected all outgoing mail and read it before deciding what could leave the camp. This letter would never pass inspection. But Klaus wrote it anyway because he needed to say the words needed to put them on paper to make them real. "Dear Führer," he began in German, his handwriting careful and precise. "I am surrounded by men losing their faith. The Americans corrupt them with abundance. They feed us as they feed themselves. They give us work that has dignity. They treat us as if we were not enemies, but merely men who happen to fight on the other side. I must stand firm against this corruption. I must remember who I am, what I believe, why I served. But every morning I smell bacon cooking. Every morning I see men who were starving grow healthy again. Every morning I watch American soldiers laugh with German prisoners over breakfast as if war was a football match that ended and now everyone goes home friends. How do I resist an enemy who shows me kindness? How do I maintain hatred toward men who treat me better than my own officers did? I must stand firm. I must." Klaus folded the letter and put it under his mattress. He would add to it each day, a diary of resistance, a record of his struggle against American generosity. But Klaus had no idea that in 72 hours, he would face a test that would break him completely. The next morning, Heinrich reported to the kitchen at 5 a.m. for equipment training. Franz came with him along with three other German cooks who'd accepted positions. An American sergeant named Robert Hayes supervised the training, working through translation to explain each piece of equipment. Hayes was 28 years old, from Chicago, with the practical manner of someone who'd worked in his family's restaurant before the war. He understood kitchens, understood the rhythm of breakfast service, the choreography of lunch rush, the quiet efficiency of dinner prep. "This is the mixer," Hayes said, patting the steel bowl like you'd pat a reliable horse. "Holds 200 pounds of dough. Takes 8 minutes to knead properly. Who wants to try?" Heinrich raised his hand. Hayes showed him the controls. On, off. Speed settings from 1 to 10. Safety lock so the machine won't run with the bowl removed. Simple, elegant, American. Heinrich pressed the button. The motor engaged with a deep hum. The dough hook began to turn. He watched it for a full minute, just watched it work, doing in seconds what had taken him hours of brutal physical labor. Franz stood beside him, both of them hypnotized by the simple mechanical rotation. "You okay?" Hayes asked. "I have wasted 15 years of my life," Heinrich said quietly in German. The young private hesitated, then relayed the words. Hayes smiled, not unkindly. "You didn't waste anything, you learned the craft. Now you're learning the tools. That's called progress, friend." Friend. The translator stumbled over the word, as if unsure how to render it in German when speaking from captor to captive. They moved through the kitchen like students on the first day of school, the industrial dishwasher that could clean 8,000 plates per hour, the steam kettles that held 80 gallons of soup, the proof boxes that let bread rise at controlled temperature and humidity, the slicing machines, the scales, the thermometers, every tool calibrated and maintained and ready. By noon, Heinrich's head hurt from trying to absorb everything. By evening, he'd filled 6 pages in his notebook with diagrams and measurements and notes about equipment he'd never dreamed existed. That night, he wrote one more line before sleep. "I came here believing German efficiency was superior to American chaos. I was wrong. This isn't Kate. This is a different kind of order, one that serves the many, not the few." He closed the notebook and tucked it under his pillow. Outside, somewhere into the Texas darkness, a coyote called. Heinrich thought about tomorrow, about learning to use machines that would have made his work in Munich seem medieval, about the strangeness of being taught by the enemy, about the fact that Lieutenant Cooper had called this place where he'd work a kitchen, not a prison mess. The photograph in his pocket pressed against his chest. Martha, Sophie, summer 39. Tomorrow he would cook, not to survive, not to stretch meager rations into impossible portions, but to cook the way he'd learned in Munich, the way his masters had taught him, with quality ingredients and proper tools and the dignity of craftsmanship. Tomorrow the American military would trust a German prisoner of war with 200 pounds of flour, with fresh eggs and real butter, with the responsibility of feeding 2,000 men. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight Heinrich simply slept. And for the first time in 18 months, he slept without hunger, gnawing at his belly. The sound came first, a rhythmic clanging of metal trays sliding on steel rails echoing through the pre-dawn darkness of the Texas camp. Heinrich stood at his station behind the serving line, watching the American soldiers file through the mess hall doors at 6 a.m. sharp. Behind them came the German prisoners, indistinguishable now, except for the letters POWs stenciled on their backs. Same line, same food, same everything. The American military operates on a principle that would seem wasteful, even insane to German efficiency. Every man eats the same, private to general, guard to prisoner. The same generous portions Heinrich had been shocked by weeks ago. No exceptions. Heinrich didn't believe it. Even now, even after a week of seeing it with his own eyes, he thought it was a trick, a temporary kindness before the real punishment began. But the punishment never came. Lieutenant Cooper stood near the coffee urns supervising the morning service with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. He held a clipboard and occasionally made notes, checking portions against regulations, ensuring quality met standards. He nodded to Heinrich as the line started moving. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Not just filled it, but saturated it, overwhelming everything else. Heinrich had baked through the night, his first solo shift, 200 loaves rising and baking in those magnificent American ovens. The crust had come out perfect golden brown with that exact crackle when you tapped it. The interior soft and white, in uniform. Every single loaf identical to the next. In German bakeries, variation was expected, even celebrated. Each baker had his signature, his quirk, his slight deviation from the standard. But here consistency was the goal. When a soldier in California bit into army bread, it should taste exactly like the bread a soldier in Texas ate. Standardization, reliability, the American way. The metal trays moved down the line. Heinrich's job was simple. 4 ounces of scrambled eggs per man. Exactly 4 ounces. He had a scale beside him and a practiced eye that could measure without weighing after years of rationing. But the Americans wanted precision, so he weighed the first portion of every shift to calibrate his eye, then served by instinct. A private came through, young, maybe 19, with acne scars and tired eyes from whatever duty he'd pulled overnight. Heinrich scooped eggs onto his plate. The private nodded thanks and moved on. Then a sergeant older with Korea campaign ribbons on his chest. Same portion, same nod. Then a corporal, then another private, then a German prisoner who'd worked in the motor pool, then an American lieutenant, then another prisoner. No difference, no variation. The line kept moving and Heinrich kept serving, and the eggs kept coming from those massive steam tables that held enough for 500 men without running low. Franz worked the next station serving bacon. 4 strips per man cooked to the same crispy perfection every time. Beyond him, another German prisoner named Otto handled toast. 2 slices buttered warm. The assembly line of American breakfast, precise as a factory, feeding an army with mechanical efficiency that somehow felt more humane than the careful hierarchies Heinrich had known in the Wehrmacht. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone had left them on all night, and they cast everything in that particular flat brightness that erases shadows and makes the world feel both real and unreal at the same time. The concrete floor showed scuff marks from 1,000 boots. The stainless steel reflected distorted faces. And through it all, the smell of coffee percolating in those giant urns, 500 gallons brewing every morning, enough that men could come back for seconds and thirds, and the supply never ran dry. Heinrich's hands moved automatically now. Scoop, portion, serve. Scoop, portion, serve. The rhythm of it became meditation. His mind wandered while his body worked, thinking about the mathematics of this abundance. 6,000 pounds of flour delivered every Monday, 2,000 pounds of sugar, 800 pounds of butter, eggs by the thousands arriving in crates stacked 6 high in the walk-in refrigerator. These weekly shipments to a single POW camp exceeded monthly provisions for an entire Wehrmacht regiment during the same period. The numbers were obscene, wasteful, gloriously impossibly wasteful by German standards. And yet nothing was wasted. Every scrap had a purpose. Leftover bread became bread pudding. Excess vegetables went into soup stock. Even the bacon grease was collected and saved for future cooking. American abundance wasn't careless, it was calculated. They produced so much that even careful use of leftovers still meant throwing away food that would have fed a German platoon. The psychology of it was devastating. How do you fight an enemy that can afford to waste more than you can afford to use? A man reached Heinrich's station and the rhythm broke. Heinrich looked up and froze. The man wore a general's stars on his collar, silver eagles on his shoulders. He held his tray like every other soldier, waiting patiently in line behind a private who couldn't have been older than 18. Heinrich's hand trembled. He scooped eggs, but his precision failed him. Too much, nearly 5 ounces instead of 4. He started to scrape some back. "That's fine, son," the general said in English. The young private beside the line relayed the words, but Heinrich had already understood. The general's tone, casual and unbothered, said more than the words themselves. Heinrich finished serving. The eggs slid onto the general's plate, identical to every other portion except for that extra ounce. The general looked at Heinrich, really looked at him, making eye contact in a way that German officers never did with enlisted men, let alone prisoners. "Thanks, chef," the general said. "This smells great." Then he moved on. Moved to Franz's station for bacon, to Otto's for toast, to the coffee urn, where he filled his own cup without waiting for anyone to serve him. And then, most impossible of all, the general walked to a table and sat down with 3 enlisted men, corporals and privates, and started eating breakfast while talking about the weather. Heinrich watched from his station, the serving spoon still in his hand, eggs congealing slightly on the metal surface. Around him, the line continued to move, but he couldn't move with it. Franz had to nudge him, whisper in German to keep working before Heinrich's hands remembered their job. A general said thank you to a prisoner. The world tilted slightly, not enough that anyone else would notice, but enough that Heinrich felt it. Everything he'd been taught about hierarchy and order and the proper distance between ranks was cracking. Not shattering. Not yet. Just cracking. And through that crack, light began to seep in. The morning shift ended at 9. Heinrich and the other German cooks cleaned their stations, wiped down the stainless steel prepared for lunch service. Lieutenant Cooper made his rounds, checking their work, offering corrections in that patient teacher's voice. "You're doing good," Cooper said. "Real good. Better than some of the American cooks we've had." "It's not difficult," Heinrich said, the German words coming automatically before translation could catch up. "When you have proper ingredients and equipment, cooking is easy." Cooper smiled. "That's the point. We want it easy. We want every camp from here to California serving the same quality food. Can't have soldiers eating great in one place and terrible in another. Bad for morale." In Germany, Heinrich wanted to say officers eat great and enlisted men eat terrible. That's not bad for morale. That's proper order. But he didn't say it because he'd seen the general eating with privates. And that cracked foundation was spreading hairline fractures running through everything he thought he knew about proper order. After lunch service, the German cooks had free time. 2 hours before dinner prep. Some men slept. Others wrote letters that would be read by censors before being mailed home, if they were mailed at all. Heinrich took his notebook and walked to the edge of the compound near the fence line where the desert scrub began and the Texas heat shimmered in waves off the sand. He opened the notebook and wrote, not recipes this time, observations, February 24th, 1943. Today I served eggs to a general who said thank you. He ate the same food as the private in front of him. I have been here 9 days. I have gained 4 pounds. The other men say the same. We are prisoners who grow fat while our country starves. Why do they feed us this way? It cannot be kindness. Armies do not run on kindness. There must be a reason. A strategy, something I don't understand yet. Franz says they feed us because they can. Because showing abundance is a form of power. Making the enemy realize how thoroughly they've lost, not just on the battlefield, but in every measure of production and capability. I think Franz is right, but I think it's more than that. I think they feed us this way because they feed everyone this way. Because in America, bacon is just bacon, and a general is just a man who needs breakfast. This terrifies me more than any weapon. He closed the notebook and sat there watching the desert breathe. Heat waves rising, dust devils spinning in the distance. Somewhere a coyote called the sound carrying across the flat expanse. The fence was 10 feet high, topped with wire, but the gates stood open during the day, and guards were sparse. You could walk out if you wanted, walk right into the Texas desert and die of thirst before sundown. Nobody walked out, because where would they go, and why would they leave 3,400 calories a day to starve in the wilderness? The Americans had built a prison with no walls, just food and work and the knowledge that outside was worse than inside. That evening, Heinrich returned to Barracks 7 to find Franz waiting by his bunk. Franz's face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. It's Klaus, Franz said in German, keeping his voice low. He's sick. Fever. Bad cough. Heinrich felt something cold settle in his stomach. Pneumonia was common in camps. Men weakened by malnutrition, stressed by captivity, vulnerable to any infection. And Klaus had been refusing to adapt, maintaining his rigid resistance to American care. Did he see the doctor, Heinrich asked? He refused, Franz said. For 2 days now. Says he won't accept enemy medical treatment. Heinrich closed his eyes. Pride. Stupid, deadly pride. Where is he in Barracks 3? The Americans moved him to isolation when they heard the cough. But he's getting worse. They found Klaus in a small room at the end of Barracks 3 lying on a cot with a wet cloth on his forehead. His breathing was labored, each inhale followed by a rattling cough. His skin was gray. His eyes, when they opened, showed no recognition. An American medic stood by the door, a young private with Red Cross insignia and a medical bag. He'd been trying to examine Klaus, but Klaus kept pushing him away between coughs. He needs treatment, the medic said through the ever-present translator. Pneumonia may be worse. If he doesn't get antibiotics soon, he could die. Tell him no. Klaus managed between coughs, his voice barely a whisper. No American medicine. No American help. Heinrich knelt beside the cot. Klaus, he said in German. This is foolish. You're dying. Better to die true to the cause, Klaus said, than cough so hard his whole body convulsed. The cause is lost, Heinrich said quietly. Germany is losing. The war is ending. And your death here in this room accomplishes nothing. Nothing except to deprive your family of a father, your country of a citizen, the world of a skilled cook. Klaus closed his eyes. Tears leaked from the corners. I took an oath, Klaus whispered. Loyalty unto death. You took an oath to serve Germany, Heinrich said. You can't serve Germany dead. They sat there in silence, broken only by Klaus's labored breathing. The American medic waited by the door, patient as stone. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows through the window. Somewhere distant, a bell rang for dinner service. Finally, Klaus opened his eyes and looked at the medic. Help me, he said in German. The young private related, and the medic moved immediately, all business, now checking pulse and temperature and listening to lungs with a stethoscope. He gave Klaus 2 pills and a cup of water, supporting his head while he swallowed. Antibiotics, the medic explained. Sulfa drugs. New stuff. Works fast if we caught it early enough. An hour later, a doctor arrived. Captain James Morrison, 42 years old from Pittsburgh, with the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too much death and wasn't interested in seeing more. He examined Klaus thoroughly, professionally, without comment on the fact that this patient had been refusing treatment out of ideology. When Morrison finished, he sat on the edge of the column and waited for Klaus to focus on him. Why did you save me? Klaus asked, his voice still weak but clearer now. Morrison considered the question. I don't see enemies, he said finally. I see pneumonia, and I'm treating it. But I killed Americans, Klaus said. Russians, even civilians in Poland. Morrison's face didn't change. And now you're a human being who was sick. That's all I need to know. Klaus turned away, facing the wall. His shoulders shook. Not from coughing now, but from crying. The silent, chest-heaving crying of a man whose certainties have crumbled. Heinrich and Franz left him there, followed Morrison out into the evening air. Will he live? Heinrich asked. If the drugs work, Morrison said. Pneumonia's tricky, but he's strong, young enough. He's got a chance. They watched Morrison walk back to the medical building, his shadow stretching long in the sunset. The Americans corrupt us with kindness, Franz said quietly in German. How do you fight that? You don't, Heinrich replied. You surrender to it. 3 days later, Klaus was well enough to sit up. A week after that, he was released back to general population. He walked slowly across the compound to Barracks 7, still weak, still recovering. Heinrich and Franz were outside smoking cigarettes that the camp store sold for pennies. Klaus approached, stopped a few feet away, looked at them both with eyes that held something different now. Not hardness, not ideology, just weariness. You were right, Klaus said to Heinrich. I was wrong. Heinrich said nothing, just nodded. I owe you an apology, Klaus continued. You saw this before I did. The Americans aren't our captors, they're our teachers. And what they're teaching is that there's another way, a better way. He held out his hand. Heinrich took it. They shook 2 men who'd been enemies, becoming something else. Not quite friends yet, but no longer enemies either. That night, Klaus joined the kitchen crew. 15 German cooks became 16. The resistance ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet handshake and the understanding that sometimes surrender is wisdom, not weakness. The days blended together after that. Morning service, lunch prep, dinner shift, clean up. The rhythm of kitchen work unchanged since the first baker mixed flour and water in ancient Mesopotamia. But the tools were American. The abundance was American. The philosophy was American. Heinrich kept his notebook, kept writing observations, measurements, techniques. The pages filled with diagrams of equipment, with recipes adapted for mass production, with notes about efficiency and waste reduction and quality control. He was building something, though he didn't know what yet. A reference, a manual, a blueprint for a future he couldn't quite imagine. Franz noticed. One evening after dinner service, he sat beside Heinrich in the barracks and looked at the open notebook. You planning something? Franz asked in German. Maybe, Heinrich said. Germany will need to rebuild after this war. Food will be the first priority. And we have knowledge now that most Germans don't have. Knowledge about how to feed thousands efficiently, humanely, abundantly. You think they'll listen? Franz asked. To former POWs, to men who surrendered, I think hungry people listen to anyone who can feed them, Heinrich replied. Franz smiled, then pulled out his own notebook. Smaller than Heinrich's, less detailed, but filled with the same kind of observations, the same gathering of knowledge. I've been thinking the same thing, Franz admitted. Otto too. Klaus is starting to take notes now. We're all seeing the same possibility. What possibility that we could bring this back to Germany? Not just the recipes, the whole system, the efficiency, the equality, the idea that feeding people well isn't waste, it's investment. Heinrich looked at his friend, really looked at him. Franz wasn't just surviving anymore. He was planning, dreaming, building a future in his mind while his body worked in the present. We should coordinate, Heinrich said, pool our knowledge, create something complete, a comprehensive guide to American institutional cooking. Franz nodded slowly. A manual, he said, equipment specifications, recipes, management systems, everything needed to set up an operation like this. The two men sat there in the dimming light of the Texas evening, prisoners of war, plotting not escape, but transformation. Around them, other men talked or slept or wrote letters home. None of them knowing that these two bakers were beginning a project that would eventually employ thousands and feed hundreds of thousands. The crack in Heinrich's certainty had widened into an opening, and through that opening possibility was flooding in. On the 33rd day of his captivity, Heinrich received permission to tour the camp's main bakery. This was different from the mess hall ovens. This was industrial production. Lieutenant Cooper escorted him personally along with Franz and Otto, walking them across the compound to a building that looked like a warehouse. Inside, the scale was overwhelming. Mixers 3 times the size of the mess hall equipment. Ovens that could bake 800 loaves simultaneously. A production line where dough went in one end and finished bread came out the other, wrapped and ready for distribution. 12 men working in coordinated shifts producing 11,000 loaves per day. Heinrich stood at the entrance and couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing. This single bakery produced more bread in a day than the entire German Field Kitchen Corps in North Africa produced in a week. Franz walked the line, slowly touching equipment, asking questions. Otto pulled out his notebook and started sketching, trying to capture the layout, the flow, the logical progression from raw materials to finished product. The head baker was a sergeant named Miller, 50 years old, with flour permanently embedded in the creases of his hands. He'd been a commercial baker in civilian life, running a shop in St. Louis that supplied restaurants and hotels. The Army had taken his expertise and multiplied it by 1,000. This is how you feed an army, Miller said, gesturing at the production line. Not individual ovens in field kitchens. Centralized production, distribution networks, economies of scale. He showed them the recipe cards. Every single bread variety used in the Army standardized down to the gram. White bread, wheat bread, rye, rolls. Each one tested and perfected so that a baker in Texas made identical bread to a baker in California. Consistency is key, Miller explained. Soldier in boot camp should taste the same bread as soldier in the field. Creates comfort, familiarity, one less thing to worry about. Heinrich absorbed every word, asked questions about temperature control, about humidity in the proof boxes, about the chemical composition of the flour, and how it affected gluten development. Technical questions, professional questions, the questions of a craftsman seeing art elevated to science. After 2 hours, Cooper led them back to the mess hall. The 3 German bakers walked in silence, each processing what they'd seen. Finally, Otto spoke. "We can't fight this," he said in German. "We can't compete with this. Germany's best bakeries are small-time compared to this." "That's not the point," Heinrich said. "The point is to learn from it, to understand that efficiency at scale doesn't mean sacrificing quality, to see that American abundance isn't accidental, it's engineered." They reached the mess hall and stood outside watching the sun set over the Texas desert. The sky turned orange and purple, and red colors so vivid they seemed artificial. "When we go home," Franz said quietly, "we bring this knowledge with us." "If we go home," Otto corrected. When Heinrich said firmly, "The war will end. We will go home. And when we do, we'll build bakeries like that one. We'll feed people the way Americans feed people, with dignity, with abundance, with the understanding that a well-fed population is a productive population. Klaus joined them, having finished his shift in the kitchen. He'd been listening. I used to think American abundance was decadence, Klaus said. Waste. Now I see its strategy. They outproduce us because they feed their workers well. Their workers produce more because they're well fed. It's a circle. A positive circle instead of our negative spiral of rationing and scarcity. The four men stood together as darkness fell. Above them, stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky. The same stars that shone over Germany, over the battlefields, over the whole wounded world. Tomorrow they would cook breakfast for 2,000 men. The day after the same. And every day after that until the war ended and they went home or died here or grew old in this strange limbo between captivity and freedom. But tonight, standing under those stars, they made a silent pact to learn everything, to document everything, to carry this knowledge home like seeds from a new world ready to plant in the ruins of the old. The crack had become a canyon, and Heinrich Adler, former Bosch Nazi soldier, loyal husband to a dead wife, grieving father of a dead daughter, baker from Munich, who'd sworn vengeance on the world, stood on the edge of that canyon and chose to leap. Not into darkness, into light. The American light of abundance and equality, and the radical idea that every person, regardless of rank or race or history, deserves to eat well. It would take him 20 years to fully understand what happened in those first weeks of captivity, 20 years to articulate the transformation. But the seed was planted that evening under the Texas stars, the seed that would grow into bakeries and businesses and thousands of jobs. The seed that would help rebuild a shattered Germany. The seed that started with a simple breakfast and a general who said thank you. Morning formation happened at 5:30 before the sun burned away the cool desert night. 200 German prisoners stood in loose rows while an American corporal called roll, mispronouncing names with cheerful consistency. Heinrich had learned to answer to Adel or instead of correcting the pronunciation. Small battles weren't worth fighting when you'd already lost the war. Klaus stood 3 rows back, still thin from his bout with pneumonia but recovering. His presence at formation was itself a statement. 2 weeks ago he'd been in the resistance barracks refusing to participate. Now he stood with the kitchen crew waiting for work assignments like everyone else. The corporal finished roll and turned the formation over to Lieutenant Cooper, who climbed onto a wooden platform so everyone could see him. The young private from Milwaukee stood beside him ready to translate. Gentlemen, Cooper began waiting for translation. Starting Monday, we're making a change to mess operations. German cooks will prepare meals for the entire camp. Americans and Germans together. No separate facilities, no separate menus. One kitchen, feeding everyone. The words hung in the morning air. Around Heinrich, men shifted weight from foot to foot. Murmured conversations in German started and stopped. This wasn't just integration. This was something else entirely. This was asking the defeated to feed their conquerors. Anyone who doesn't like it can speak to me directly. Cooper continued, we're not forcing anyone, but this is the new policy starting Monday. Dismissed. The formation broke apart. Men drifted toward the mess hall for breakfast, talking in low voices. Heinrich caught Franz's eye. Franz shrugged his face unreadable. Klaus surprisingly smiled. A small, bitter smile that held recognition of some private irony. They ate breakfast in relative silence. The eggs tasted the same as always. The bacon crispy and perfect. The coffee strong and abundant. But the knowledge that Monday would bring change colored everything. Heinrich found himself studying the American soldiers eating nearby. Young men mostly. Farm boys and city kids turned into soldiers by necessity. They laughed over breakfast, complained about duty assignments, talked about girls back home and when the war might end. Not so different from German soldiers, Heinrich thought. Take away the uniforms and you couldn't tell who'd been the enemy. After breakfast, Heinrich was scraping his tray into the waste bin when Klaus appeared beside him. Can we talk? Klaus asked in German, his voice low. They walked outside, away from the mess hall, toward the motor pool where morning maintenance created enough noise to mask conversation. Klaus lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The pneumonia had taken more out of him than just physical strength. I need to tell you something, Klaus said, about the others. The ones who refused with me. Heinrich waited. 9 of us went to the resistance barracks, Klaus continued. But three of them are planning something. A protest. They want to refuse the integration. Make a scene. Force the Americans to punish them. What kind of protest? Klaus exhaled smoke. They want you to lead it. Heinrich felt something cold settle in his chest. Me, you're the senior chef, the one everyone respects. If you refuse, others will follow. If you lead a strike, it becomes legitimate resistance instead of just troublemakers complaining. Who are they? Klaus named three men. All former Wehrmacht, not SS like Klaus had been. All older 40s and 50s. All from that generation that had fought in the First War and lost, then embraced the Nazi promises of restored greatness. All true believers in a cause that was crumbling around them. They're going to approach you tonight, Klaus said, after dinner service, in the barracks. And you're telling me this, why? Because Klaus said, crushing his cigarette under his boot, I've learned something these past weeks. Pride is expensive, and sometimes the price is your life. I almost paid it. I don't want to see others make the same mistake. What do you want me to do? Klaus looked at him directly. Whatever you think is right. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm just giving you warning. So you're not surprised. They parted ways. Heinrich went to his morning duties in the kitchen, preparing for lunch service, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd escape this kind of confrontation by being quiet, by keeping his head down and doing his work. But apparently silence wasn't enough. They wanted him to choose sides publicly. The lunch service passed in a blur. Serve the line, clean the stations, prepare for dinner. The mechanical rhythm of kitchen work that usually calmed his mind did nothing today. He kept thinking about Monday, about integration, about what it meant to cook for your former enemies as if they were brothers. Franz noticed his distraction. You're burning the sauce, Franz said quietly in German. Heinrich looked down. The pan was indeed smoking. He pulled it off the heat, cursing under his breath. What's wrong? Franz asked. Heinrich told him about Klaus's warning, about the three men planning to ask him to lead a strike. Franz listened without interrupting, his hands continuing to chop vegetables with metronomic precision. What are you going to say? Franz asked when Heinrich finished. I don't know. Franz set down his knife. I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can ignore it if you want. Heinrich nodded. These men want you to lead a strike because they're afraid, Franz said. They're afraid that if we accept this integration, it means we were wrong about everything. Wrong about the war, wrong about superiority, wrong about the whole ideology we were taught. Refusing to cook is their way of holding on to the last piece of certainty they have left. And what do you think? Franz picked up his knife again. I think certainty is overrated. I think we were wrong about a lot of things. And I think learning from your enemies is smarter than dying for your pride. That evening after dinner service ended and the kitchen was clean, Heinrich returned to Barracks 7 to find exactly what Klaus had predicted. Three men waiting by his bunk. They stood when he entered, their faces grave with the weight of what they were about to ask. The oldest was named Werner, 53 years old, from Dresden, with gray hair and the ramrod posture of a career soldier. He'd cooked for officer messes for 20 years before the war, maintaining strict hierarchies with religious devotion. Heinrich, Werner said formally, "We need to speak with you about Monday." Heinrich sat on his bunk. The other two men, Friedrich and Josef, flanked Werner like seconds in a duel. "We cannot accept this integration," Werner continued. "It's a humiliation. We are prisoners being asked to serve our captors, to cook for them as if we were servants. This violates every principle of military honor." "We're already cooking for them," Heinrich said quietly. "We've been doing it for weeks. In their kitchen, under their supervision," Werner countered. "This is different. This is asking us to take ownership, to be responsible for feeding them, to act as if we're partners instead of prisoners. And that's worse," "Yes," Werner said firmly, "because it makes us collaborators. It erases the distinction between captor and captive. It suggests that we're equal when we're clearly not." Heinrich looked at the three men, saw the desperation in their eyes, the need for this stand to mean something, the hunger for significance when everything they'd fought for was collapsing. "What do you want from me?" Heinrich asked, though he already knew. "We want you to refuse," Werner said, publicly. "On Monday morning, when they ask us to take over the integrated kitchen, we want you to say no. As senior chef, as the man everyone respects. If you refuse, others will follow. We can force them to maintain separate facilities. And if I don't refuse, then we'll do it without you, Werner said. But it will be less effective. Men listen to you, Heinrich. You have authority they respect. Heinrich stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the compound. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. American soldiers walked past laughing about something. Two German prisoners played chess at a picnic table someone had built from scrap wood. Life continuing despite captivity, despite war, despite everything. I'm going to cook, Heinrich said, his voice carrying clearly across the barracks. Just like I told Klaus, just like I told myself. The room went silent, 40 men in their bunks pretending to read or sleep, all listening now. Werner's face flushed red. You're refusing to stand with us. No, Heinrich said, turning to face them. I'm refusing to stand against reality. The war is over for us. Germany is losing. Everything we were taught about superiority and destiny was a lie. And cooking a meal for an American soldier doesn't make me a collaborator. It makes me a chef doing his job. You're a traitor, Werner spat. Heinrich met his eyes without flinching. I'm a chef. Chefs cook. That's not treason. That's profession. Werner stepped forward, his hands balled into fists. For a moment, Heinrich thought the old man might actually swing. Then Klaus appeared beside Heinrich, his presence a quiet statement of support. He's right, Klaus said in German. I learned that the hard way. You can learn it now or you can learn it later when you're dying from pneumonia because you're too proud to accept help. Your choice. Werner looked between them. His face cycled through emotions too fast to track. Anger, betrayal, fear, finally settling on something like resignation. You've all been corrupted, Werner said. The Americans have broken you with kindness. Maybe, Heinrich said, or maybe we were already broken, and they're giving us a chance to put ourselves back together differently. Werner and his two companions left without another word. The barracks remained quiet after they'd gone. Then slowly conversation resumed. Men rolled over in their bunks. Someone dealt cards for a poker game. Life continuing. Franz sat down beside Heinrich. That was brave, Franz said. That was necessary, Heinrich corrected. Someone had to say it out loud. Do you believe it? What you told them, Heinrich thought about the question. Thought about Martha and Sophie. About the photograph in his pocket. About 18 months of cooking with sand and sawdust while men starved. About American generals saying thank you. About a doctor who saved Klaus without asking what he'd done in the war. I believe, Heinrich said slowly, that cooking a good meal is never wrong, regardless of who eats it. Monday morning came with clouds threatening rain, unusual for the Texas desert but not unprecedented. The German kitchen crew assembled in the mess hall at 4 a.m., earlier than normal, to prepare for the transition. Lieutenant Cooper was already there along with Captain Sullivan, the mess operations officer Heinrich had only seen from a distance before. Sullivan was 42 years old from Boston, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen combat before being reassigned to logistics. He had a reputation for fairness and an absolute intolerance for waste. The kind of officer who ate the same food as his men and slept in the same tents when they were in the field. Gentlemen, Sullivan said through translation, this is voluntary. You can say no if you want to. The 15 German cooks stood in a loose semicircle. Werner and his two allies were conspicuously absent, having refused to attend. But everyone else was here. Heinrich, Franz, Klaus, Otto, and 11 others who decided that cooking was better than protest. I appreciate you being here, Sullivan continued. What we're doing today is unprecedented, but I believe it's right. Food is fundamental. It crosses all boundaries. And if we can share a meal, maybe we can start to build something better than war. He paused, looking at each man in turn. I'm not asking you to betray your country. I'm asking you to cook, to use your skills and knowledge to feed people who need feeding. Same as you've been doing, just with expanded responsibility. Heinrich raised his hand. Sullivan nodded to him. What exactly do you want from us? Heinrich asked. Sullivan smiled. I want you to run this kitchen as if it were your own. Make decisions about menus, about preparation methods, about quality control. I want American soldiers to eat food prepared by German professionals and realize that skill has no nationality. And I want you German cooks to work alongside American cooks and learn from each other. This isn't about making you Americans, Sullivan continued. It's about making you partners. For however long this war lasts and you're in our care. The room was quiet except for rain starting to tap against the roof. Heinrich looked at Franz. Franz nodded slightly. Klaus stood with his arms crossed, but his face was open, listening. We'll need resources, Heinrich said. If we're responsible for quality, we need authority over procurement and preparation. You'll have it, Sullivan said. Within reason. You'll work with Sergeant Hayes on requisitions. He'll approve purchases. But you tell him what you need. And if there are problems, Heinrich asked, if German and American cooks disagree, then we work it out like professionals, Sullivan said. Discussion, compromise, finding solutions. That's how kitchens operate in my experience. Heinrich took a deep breath. Around him, he could feel the other German cooks waiting for his response. The senior chef, the one everyone respected. His decision would set the tone. We accept, Heinrich said. We'll run your kitchen, we'll feed your men, and we'll do it well. Sullivan's smile widened. I expected nothing less. The first integrated service began at 6 a.m. Heinrich stood behind the serving line exactly where he'd stood for weeks now. But everything felt different. American cooks worked beside German cooks. Sergeant Hayes supervised alongside Lieutenant Cooper. The hierarchy had flattened, somehow transformed into something more collaborative. The line started moving, soldiers filing through with their trays. But this time Heinrich wasn't just portioning eggs. He was responsible. If the food was bad, it reflected on him personally. If it was good, the credit was his to share. The first man through was a private, barely 20 years old. Heinrich served him eggs. 4 ounces, perfect portion. The private nodded thanks and moved on. Then came a German prisoner. Heinrich served him the same portion. Exactly the same. No difference. Then an American sergeant. Same portion. Then another German. Same. The rhythm established itself quickly. Men moving through the line, receiving food, sitting down to eat. Americans and Germans at the same tables now, not segregated. Conversations happening in broken English and broken German with hand gestures filling the gaps. Franz worked beside an American corporal named Miller at the bacon station. They'd developed a system without words. Miller fried Franz plated. 4 strips per person, crispy and perfect. When they ran low, Miller called back to the kitchen in English and Franz called back in German, and somehow the supplies appeared and the line never stopped. An hour into service, a general entered the mess hall. Not the same one who'd thanked Heinrich weeks ago, but another one. Older, with more ribbons on his chest and the bearing of someone who'd commanded in serious combat. The room didn't quite come to attention, but conversations quieted. The general grabbed a tray and joined the line like anyone else. No cutting, no special treatment, just a man waiting for breakfast. He reached Heinrich's station. Heinrich served eggs, his hands steady now. The general looked at the portion, then at Heinrich, then back at the eggs. You the one Sergeant Hayes told me about, the general asked. The baker from Munich. Yes, sir, Heinrich said through the translator standing nearby. Hayes says you're the best he's seen, the general said. Says you could run a commercial operation. I was trained well, Sir Heinrich replied. The general nodded. Keep it up. Men eat better now than they did a month ago. That matters for morale. He moved down the line. Heinrich watched him go. Watched him sit with captains and lieutenants and corporals, all mixed together. Watched him eat the eggs that a German prisoner had served him. Franz nudged Heinrich with his elbow. Did you hear that? Franz whispered in German. A general complimented you. A German prisoner. I heard, Heinrich said. Things are changing, Franz said. Things have changed, Heinrich corrected. The service ended at 9, same as always. Cleanup happened with Germans and Americans working side by side, everyone knowing their role, the choreography of kitchen work transcending language. Heinrich found himself working next to Sergeant Hayes, both of them scrubbing the massive griddles. You did good today, Hayes said, not bothering with a translator. His tone made the meaning clear, even if Heinrich didn't understand every word. Thank you, Heinrich said in English. His first English words spoken to an American. 2 syllables that felt like crossing a border. Hayes smiled and clapped him on the shoulder, then went back to scrubbing. That afternoon, Heinrich sat in the barracks writing in his notebook. The pages were filling fast now. Technical details about American cooking methods, observations about equipment and efficiency, but also personal reflections. The slow transformation of his understanding. March 1st, 1943, he wrote in German. Today we became partners instead of prisoners. The Americans call it integration. I call it the beginning of something I don't have words for yet. When you feed a man, you establish a bond, even if that man was your enemy, especially if that man was your enemy. Because the act of feeding says, I want you to live. And wanting your enemy to live is the first step toward not having enemies anymore. A shadow fell across the page. Heinrich looked up to find Werner standing beside his bunk. The older man's face was haggard. He'd lost weight in just the few days since the confrontation. Pride was expensive, Klaus had said. Werner was paying the price. I was wrong, Werner said quietly in German. About the strike, about refusing, about all of it. Heinrich closed his notebook, marked his place with the photograph. Martha, Sophie, summer 39. That daily reminder of what he'd lost and why revenge had tasted like ashes. What changed your mind, Heinrich asked. I watched today, Werner said. Watched you work alongside the Americans. Watched them treat you with respect. Watched men eat good food and laugh together despite being enemies. And I realized something. What? That hatred is exhausting, Werner said, and I'm too tired to carry it anymore. He held out his hand. Heinrich took it. They shook two old soldiers finding a different kind of armistice. Tomorrow I'll join the kitchen crew, Werner said. If you'll have me, we'll have you, Heinrich replied. We can always use another pair of hands. Werner nodded and walked away. Heinrich opened his notebook again and added one more line. Today the resistance ended, not with force, not with punishment, but with the simple realization that some wars aren't worth fighting. That evening after dinner service, Lieutenant Cooper called Heinrich into his office. The small room felt even smaller, with both of them inside, but Cooper gestured to the chair across from his desk. I wanted to thank you, Cooper said, for what you did this morning, taking leadership, setting the tone. I just cooked, Heinrich said. You did more than that, Cooper replied. You showed the other men that cooperation isn't surrender, that there's dignity in doing good work regardless of politics. He pulled out a file folder and opened it on the desk. I've been authorized to offer you something, Cooper said. Starting next week, you'll be head chef for this facility. You'll supervise all kitchen operations. German and American staff. You'll report directly to me on menu planning and quality control. Heinrich stared at him. I'm a prisoner, sir. Cooper smiled. And you're also the best chef we have. The war doesn't change that. Your skills don't change that. I need someone who can run this kitchen efficiently and maintain quality. You're that person. What about the American cooks? Won't they resent taking orders from a German? That's not how I'm structuring it, Cooper said. You won't be giving orders. You'll be teaching, mentoring, sharing expertise. The Americans will learn from you, and you'll learn from them. Collaboration, not hierarchy. Heinrich thought about it. Thought about the absurdity of a POW running an American military kitchen. Thought about how far he'd come from that first breakfast when he'd wept over an egg. Thought about Werner's words. Hatred is exhausting. I accept, Heinrich said. Cooper stood and extended his hand. They shook across the desk, American lieutenant and German prisoner, sealing an agreement that would have been impossible to imagine 3 months ago. Good, Cooper said. You start Monday. We'll make the announcement at formation. Heinrich left the office in a daze. Head chef, supervisor, teacher. He'd come to this camp expecting death or torture or hard labor. Instead, he'd been given responsibility and respect and the opportunity to practice his craft at the highest level he'd ever known. Franz was waiting outside. Well, Franz asked in German. I'm the new head chef, Heinrich said, still not quite believing it. Franz laughed. Of course you are. Who else would they choose? They walked back to the barracks together as the sun set over the Texas desert. The same sky that had witnessed Heinrich's arrival now witnessed his transformation. Same stars, same moon, different man. That night, Heinrich pulled out the photograph, looked at their faces in the dim light of the barracks. He'd carried this photo as a reminder of what he'd lost, as fuel for his anger, as justification for his hatred. But looking at it now, he saw something different. Saw Martha's smile and remembered how she'd laughed at his flour-covered aprons. Saw Sophie's joy and remembered teaching her to knead dough. Saw love instead of loss. I learned something today, he whispered to the photograph in German. I learned that holding on to hatred dishonors your memory, that revenge doesn't bring you back, that the only way to honor what we had is to build something new. He kissed the photograph, put it back in his pocket, and for the first time since October of 1940, Heinrich Adler cried not from grief but from relief. The burden he'd been carrying, the weight of vengeance and anger and loss, lifted slightly. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. Tomorrow he would be head chef, would teach Americans and Germans alike, would feed 2,000 men 3 times a day with efficiency and quality and care. But tonight he was just a man who'd chosen life over death, partnership over pride, the future over the past. The crack in his certainty had become a canyon, and Heinrich had stopped fighting the fall. He was learning to fly instead. April 1943 arrived with the kind of morning that makes you believe in possibilities. The Oklahoma plains stretched endless under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Heinrich stood in the back of an army truck, one hand gripping the rail, watching the wheat fields roll past like golden waves frozen in the moment before breaking. This was his first time outside the camp in 2 months. His first time seeing America beyond the barbed wire and mess halls. The enormity of it struck him silent. Miles and miles of farmland, each acre more productive than anything he'd seen in Bavaria. Mechanized agriculture on a scale that made German farming seem medieval by comparison. Lieutenant Cooper sat across from him, clipboard on his lap, explaining the work detail. 20 German prisoners would help with the spring harvest. Local farmers needed hands. The army needed to keep prisoners occupied and productive. Everyone benefited. That was the American way. Everything had to benefit everyone, or it wasn't worth doing. The truck bounced over a dirt road, kicking up dust that hung in the still air behind them like a curtain. Franz sat beside Heinrich, his eyes wide as he took in the landscape. Klaus was further back, talking quietly with Otto about what they were seeing, all of them processing the same realization. This wasn't a nation struggling under the weight of war. This was a nation barely feeling it. The truck turned onto a smaller road and stopped at a gate. A hand-painted sign read Wilson Farm, established 1889. A man stood waiting by the gate, maybe 55 years old, wearing overalls and a straw hat against the sun. He waved as the truck approached. Bob Wilson owned 200 acres of wheat, worked it with his 2 sons, and produced more grain than Heinrich's entire village in Bavaria. Wilson didn't look like a man who commanded such productivity. He looked like any farmer, weathered, practical, the kind of man who measured success in bushels per acre in good soil. Morning, Wilson called out as they climbed down from the truck. Cooper made introductions, 20 German POWs, all with farming experience or willing to learn. Wilson nodded, sized them up with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired harvest crews his whole life. "Welcome to Oklahoma," Wilson said. His translator, a private who'd grown up speaking German at home, repeated the words. "Hope you boys are ready to work. Harvest waits for no man." They walked into the fields. The wheat stood chest-high, golden and ready. Wilson showed them the combine harvester, a massive machine that looked like something from a fever dream. 24 feet wide, cutting and threshing in one pass. One man operating it could do the work of 200 with hand tools. Heinrich stood speechless. The machine roared to life, its engine loud enough to feel in your chest. Wilson climbed into the seat and guided it into the wheat. The cutting bar at the front moved like a living thing, stalks falling in perfect rows, grain, separated from chaff, everything sorted and collected in a single mechanical breath. In one pass, that machine harvested more wheat than Heinrich had helped harvest in an entire season back home. Franz stood beside him, both of them watching in silence. There were no words for this, no way to explain to someone who hadn't seen it. American industrial agriculture wasn't just different, it was a different world entirely. They worked through in the morning, learning to follow the combine, gathering stray stalks, managing the collected grain. It was lighter work than field kitchens, but honest labor, the kind that made you feel useful. By noon, Wilson called a halt. Lunchtime, he announced, "Wife's got food ready up at the house." The house was a 2-story farmhouse, painted white with a wraparound porch and actual glass windows. Not a mansion, just a comfortable American farm home. But to men who'd been sleeping in barracks and eating in mess halls, it looked like something from a magazine. Mrs. Sarah Wilson met them on the porch. She was maybe 52, With graying hair and the calm confidence of a woman who'd raised 3 boys and weathered 40 years of farming, she smiled at the group of German prisoners standing uncertainly in her yard. "Come on in," she said through the translator. "Plenty of food. Don't be shy." Inside smelled like home. That particular combination of cooking food and lived-in comfort that no barracks or mess hall ever achieved. The dining table had been extended with boards across sawhorses, turned into something that could seat 25 people. And the food, God in heaven, the food. Fried chicken. 8 pieces for 28 people, but that wasn't the point. The point was fried chicken in the middle of a war cooked for enemy prisoners like it was Sunday dinner. Mashed potatoes with real butter, a quarter-pound of it, sitting in a dish on the table. Green beans from last year's canning, bright and fresh. Corn on the cob, 6 ears, yellow and sweet. Apple pie still warm from the oven. Sweet iced tea and a pitcher sugar freely added because sugar wasn't rationed here the way it was everywhere else in the world. Heinrich sat at the table and stared. This wasn't a special meal. Mrs. Wilson said they ate like this every Sunday. Every Sunday. While Berlin and Munich rationed bread while London lived on powdered eggs, while half the world made do with less, American farmers ate fried chicken and apple pie because it was Sunday and that's what Sunday meant. Mr. Wilson carved the chicken, giving each man a piece. He served the German prisoners first before his own sons. Heinrich took a bite and nearly wept again. The seasoning, the crisp crust, the way the meat fell off the bone. This was food cooked with care by someone who had the resources to do it right. "Where are you from in Germany?" son Wilson asked Heinrich through the translator. "Munich, sir. I was a baker. Königshof Hotel." "We need good bakers here," Wilson said, and he wasn't joking. "Hard to find someone who knows the craft. All the young men went to war. Same as Germany, I expect." "Yes, sir," Heinrich said. Sarah Wilson refilled his tea without asking the way a mother would. The gesture broke something loose in Heinrich's chest. She treated them like sons. Not prisoners, not enemies. Sons. After lunch, Wilson showed them the photograph on the wall. His father, German immigrant, came over in 1889 from Hamburg. "Probably knew your people," Wilson said to Klaus, who'd mentioned being from Hamburg. Klaus stared at the photograph. A German who became American, who built a farm in Oklahoma and raised sons who spoke English and lived American lives. The connection across generations, across oceans, across the very war they were fighting. "My grandfather used to say," Wilson continued, "that America wasn't about where you came from. It was about what you were willing to build. He came here with nothing. Built all this." He gestured at the farm, the fields, the house. 200 acres of productive land. A legacy that would outlast wars and politics and everything temporary. Heinrich thought about that photograph later, riding back to camp in the truck. A German who became American. 60 years ago, a man made that journey. Left behind everything he knew. Built something new in a strange land. And now his grandsons were feeding German prisoners fried chicken during a war against Germany. The circularity of it. The hope in it. The possibility that what mattered wasn't nations or flags or ideologies, but people willing to build instead of destroy. That night, Heinrich wrote in his notebook. One line that captured everything. "Saw a machine harvest more in an hour than we harvested in a season. Ate chicken cooked by a woman who treated enemies like sons. America isn't rich because they're lucky. They're rich because they've built systems that create abundance. And they share that abundance because they believe everyone deserves it. This is why we lost. This is why we'll keep losing until we learn." May 1943 brought new opportunities. Cooper arranged a tour of industrial facilities. Educational, he called it. But Heinrich knew it was more than that. It was showing them the engine of American power. The factories and production lines that won wars before the first shot was fired. Continental Baking Company in Indianapolis. The building covered 2 city blocks. Inside production lines that looked like something from the future. Heinrich, Franz Autospo, and 6 other German bakers walked through in silence. 240,000 loaves per day. Let that sink in. 240,000 loaves from one facility. 47 stations, each one specialized, each one manned by workers who trained for weeks to do one specific task with perfect efficiency. Dough mixed at Station 1, portioned at Station 2, shaped at 3 through 7, proofed in climate-controlled boxes at 8 through 12, baked in ovens that stretch 30 feet long at 13 through 25, cooled sliced wrapped at 26 through 47. The whole operation running like clockwork, 3 shifts daily, producing bread that tasted identical, whether it came off the line at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. The plant manager was a man named Peterson, 53 years old, started as a mixer operator 20 years ago, worked his way up. He walked them through with obvious pride. "This is how you feed a nation," Peterson said. "Not individual bakeries making what they can. Centralized production, scientific management, economies of scale." He showed them the recipe cards. Every variable controlled: temperature, humidity, mixing time, rising time, baking time. Nothing left to chance or intuition. What worked in Indianapolis worked in Los Angeles. What worked in March worked in November. "Consistency is everything," Peterson explained. "A mother buying bread in Texas should get the same quality as a mother in New York. That's the promise. That's what we deliver." Heinrich filled 20 pages of his notebook. Diagrams, numbers, flowcharts showing the progression from raw flour to finished product. Otto sketched the machinery trying to capture the scale. Franz asked technical questions about temperature control, about quality assurance, about maintenance schedules. At the end of the tour, Peterson pulled Heinrich aside. "You boys want jobs after the war?" Peterson asked. "Serious question. We're always looking for skilled bakers who understand quality." Heinrich didn't know how to respond. An offer of employment from the enemy during a war. It should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like possibility. The Heinz factory in Pittsburgh came next. 450 tons of tomatoes, processed daily into ketchup sauce soup. The scale made his head hurt. How do you even conceive of processing that much food? Where do you find that many tomatoes? But they did, every day. Farmers delivered truckloads. Machines sorted, washed, processed. More machines than people. The workers supervised. Made sure quality stayed high. Made sure nothing went wrong. But the machines did the work. Franz stood in front of a bottling line watching glass bottles fill with ketchup at a rate of 300 per minute. Each bottle identical. Each cap sealed perfectly. Each label applied straight. "This is the future," Franz said quietly in German. Not craftsmen making things by hand. Engineers designing systems that produce perfection at scale. "Is that good?" Otto asked. "Doesn't it take away the human element?" "No," Franz said. "It frees humans to do human things. Design, creativity, problem solving. Let machines handle repetition." Heinrich listened to them debate. Both were right. Something was lost when machines replaced hands. But something was gained too. Abundance, consistency, the ability to feed millions instead of hundreds. Back at camp, the 5 German bakers who'd gone on the industrial tours met in the barracks after lights out. They kept their voices low, but their excitement was hard to contain. "We need to write this all down," Otto said. "Everything we've seen, equipment specifications, production methods, the entire system. We are writing it down," Heinrich said, holding up his notebook. "But we need to coordinate, pool our knowledge, make sure we're not duplicating effort." "We need more than notes," Franz said. "We need a complete manual, something comprehensive enough that someone could use it to set up an operation from scratch." Klaus, quiet until now, spoke up. "Call it what it is. We're planning for after the war, for rebuilding Germany. We're gathering intelligence on how the Americans do it so we can do it ourselves." "Is that wrong?" Otto asked. "The Americans are letting us," Klaus pointed out. "They could keep us away from their factories. Instead, they're showing us everything." Why? Heinrich knew why. Because Americans believed in abundance. Believed that teaching others to produce didn't diminish them. That rising tides lifted all boats. That a prosperous Germany would be better for America than a destroyed one. "They want us to go home and build," Heinrich said. "They want us to see that their system works. That feeding people well makes them productive. That abundance creates stability. They're investing in peace." The 5 men made a pact that night. Each would focus on a different area. Heinrich would document equipment and technical specifications. Franz would focus on recipes and formulas. Klaus would handle quality control and management systems. Otto would diagram production workflows. And a fifth baker, a man named Dieter, who'd been an accountant before the war, would work on business economics. The manual they were building would eventually reach 212 pages, handwritten, detailed, comprehensive. A blueprint for transforming German institutional cooking from traditional craft work to American industrial efficiency. But they didn't know that yet. They just knew they were building something important, something that might matter when the war finally ended and they went home to whatever was left of Germany. June 1943 arrived hot and dry. The Texas sun beat down on Camp Blanding with the kind of heat that made even Texans complain. But inside the mess hall, preparation for something unprecedented was underway. Captain Sullivan had proposed an idea, a festival, a celebration of food and culture. German cooks would prepare traditional German dishes for the entire camp, Americans and Germans together. 2,000 people sharing a meal that crossed the battle lines. The proposal should have been controversial, probably was at higher levels. But Sullivan had a reputation as a man who got results. His mess operations ran better than any other camp in Texas. His men ate better, morale stayed high. If he said a German food festival would help, command believed him. Heinrich and Franz sat down with Sullivan and Sergeant Hayes to plan the menu. This felt surreal, planning a feast, in the middle of a war, with the enemy's full support and resources. What would you make? Sullivan asked. If you could cook anything. Traditional German food. What matters? Heinrich thought about Sunday dinners in Munich, about holidays with Martha and Sophie, about the food that meant home. Sauerbraten, he said, marinated beef, takes 3 days to prepare properly, but it's worth it. We can do 3 days, Sullivan said. What else? Spätzle, Franz added. Egg noodles, hand-scraped, has to be made fresh. Rotkohl, red cabbage braised with apples and spices. Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes. For dessert, Klaus said quietly, Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, Black Forest cake. If we can get the cherries. We can get cherries, Hayes said, making notes. Army can get anything. What quantities for 2,000 people? They worked through the mathematics. 400 pounds of beef for the Sauerbraten, 200 pounds of flour for the Spätzle, 150 dozen eggs, 75 pounds of butter, 300 pounds of potatoes, cherries, chocolate cream for the cakes, resources that would have fed a German regiment for a month, made available for a single meal. A party? A celebration during wartime. Heinrich asked the question that had been bothering him. Sir, why are you doing this, giving us these resources, letting us cook our food? Sullivan looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because food is more than nutrition, Sullivan said. It's culture, identity, connection. You men are far from home. You're prisoners, yes, but you're still human beings. And human beings need more than just calories. They need meaning, dignity, a taste of home. He paused. Plus, Sullivan added with a slight smile, I figure if we can sit down and share a meal together, maybe we remember that the men on the other side of this war are people too. Maybe that matters when the fighting stops and we have to figure out how to live together again. That's why you're doing this, Heinrich said. Not just for us, for your own men. For everyone, Sullivan corrected. War ends eventually. Peace is harder, starts with small things, like breaking bread together. The week before the festival was controlled chaos. Heinrich coordinated preparation with a precision that would have made his old masters at the Königshof proud. The beef went into marinade on Monday. Vinegar, wine, juniper berries, bay leaves. The same recipe his grandmother had used. American soldiers helped with prep work, peeling potatoes, chopping vegetables, following instructions from German cooks who spoke maybe 20 words of English. But kitchens have their own language. Show someone how to cut an onion, and nationality doesn't matter. Franz taught a young American private how to make spätzle, the scraping technique, the consistency of the dough. The private's name was Miller, from Iowa. He picked it up quickly, had good hands. This is like making noodles on my grandma's farm, Miller said. She was German. Came over before I was born. The connections were everywhere if you looked for them. German immigrants who'd become American, their grandchildren now fighting against the country their ancestors left. The tangled web of history and migration and identity that made war so much more complicated than us versus them. Klaus worked on the Black Forest cakes with an intensity that surprised everyone. He'd been a pastry chef before the war. This was his element. He taught two American bakers the technique: the chocolate cake layers, the cherry filling, the whipped cream, the way the chocolate curls had to be shaved just right. "Why does it matter so much?" one of the Americans asked. "It's just cake." Klaus looked at him seriously. "It's never just cake. It's memory, tradition, the way your grandmother's hands moved, the smell of your mother's kitchen. When you eat food made right, you taste home. That matters." The American nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that." Friday evening, July 23rd, 1943. The outdoor mess area had been transformed. Long tables arranged in rows, American and German flags hanging from poles that someone had erected that afternoon. The flags hung limp in the still evening air. No wind, just heat slowly dissipating as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The smell of cooking food filled the camp. Beef roasting, cabbage braising, bread baking, chocolate and cherries. The scent carried across the compound, pulling men toward the mess area like hunger made physical. 2,000 men gathered. 1,200 Americans, 800 German prisoners, mixing now. Not separated, that was Sullivan's rule. Random seating, Americans and Germans at the same tables. No choice in the matter. Sit where there's space. Heinrich stood behind the serving line with Franz and Klaus and Otto and 12 other German cooks. American soldiers worked beside them. Everyone in clean whites. Everyone focused on the task, serving a meal, the most basic human act of hospitality. Sullivan stood on a platform where everyone could see him. "Gentlemen," Sullivan began, no translation needed. The German prisoners understood enough English now, and the meaning was clear from tone and context. "Tonight we're doing something different. Tonight we're not Americans and Germans. We're not guards and prisoners. Tonight we're people sharing a meal." He paused, let the words settle. The men who prepared this food are professional chefs. They've cooked in hotels and restaurants. They know their craft. They've worked hard this week to bring you authentic German food. I ask that you receive it with respect, that you try it with open minds, that you remember that good food transcends borders. Another pause. After tonight, Sullivan continued, we go back to our regular duties, back to the war and everything it demands. But for a few hours, we set that aside. We eat together. We acknowledge our common humanity. We remember that when the fighting stops, we all have to live on the same small planet. He stepped down. The serving began. Heinrich ladled sauerbraten onto plates, 4-ounce portions. The meat fell apart tender. 3 days of marinating, hours of slow roasting. Perfect. Franz scooped spätzle. The noodles glossy with butter. Exactly the right texture. Klaus supervised the cakes, each slice precise. Cream and cherries and chocolate arranged just so. The line moved. Americans taking German food from German hands. Germans watching Americans taste their culture. Everyone uncertain, everyone curious. A corporal reached Heinrich's station. Young, maybe 23. From Texas, based on his accent, he looked at the dark braised meat suspiciously. What is it, the corporal asked. Sauerbraten, Heinrich said. His English was getting better. Marinated beef, traditional recipe. It looks weird, the corporal said honestly. Tastes good, Heinrich said. Trust me. The corporal took his plate and moved on. Heinrich watched him sit at a table with 3 other Americans and 2 German prisoners. Watched him cut a piece of meat. Watched him taste it. Watched his expression change from suspicion to surprise to appreciation. A minute later, the corporal was back in line. Can I have more, he asked. Heinrich smiled. Yes. Help yourself. An hour into the meal, something shifted. The initial stiffness faded. Conversations started. Men asking about recipes, about Germany, about Texas, about home and family and everything ordinary that war had made extraordinary. An American sergeant asked Franz how to make spätzle. Franz explained the technique, used hand gestures in broken English. The sergeant nodded, said he'd try it when he got home. His wife would like it. Klaus found himself explaining Black Forest cake to a captain from Mississippi. The captain said it reminded him of his mother's chocolate cake, but better. Klaus took that as high praise. Everywhere, the same scene. Men eating together, talking, laughing, not as enemies, just as people who happened to like good food. Heinrich walked through the outdoor area observing. This was Sullivan's vision made real, breaking bread together, acknowledging common humanity. It wasn't naive, it wasn't pretending the war didn't exist. It was asserting that something else existed too, something that transcended the war. He sat down at a table where 6 men were eating, 3 Americans, 3 Germans. They'd been talking about farming. One of the Americans was from Iowa, one of the Germans from Bavaria. The techniques were different, but the problems were the same. Weather, soil, markets, the universal concerns of men who worked the land. Heinrich listened, contributed nothing, just sat there feeling the weight of the moment. Men who should have been enemies sharing knowledge about growing wheat, as if the war was an interruption of normal life rather than normal life itself. That was Sullivan's genius, treating the war as the exception, peace as the norm, even while fighting preparing for what came after. The meal wound down around 9. Men lingered over coffee, the summer night finally cool enough to be comfortable. Stars appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone over Germany, over America, over every battlefield where men were dying. But here tonight, no one was dying. Everyone was eating, talking, being human in the most fundamental way. Heinrich helped with cleanup, Germans and Americans washing dishes side by side, the massive industrial sinks, the organized chaos of breaking down a meal service for 2,000, everyone knowing their role, everyone working together. Sergeant Hayes found Heinrich as they were finishing up. That was something special tonight, Hayes said. The translator was long gone, but Heinrich's English had improved enough. Thank you, Heinrich said. It felt good, cooking real food, for everyone. You did more than cook, Hayes said. You built a bridge, maybe a small one. Maybe it won't last past tonight, but it existed, and that matters. Heinrich thought about bridges, about connections, about the photograph in his pocket, about Martha and Sophie and everything he had lost, about what he was building now to honor their memory instead of avenge their death. I'm glad, Heinrich said simply. Sullivan had been right. Food was more than nutrition. It was meaning, connection, a way to say we're all in this together even when we're on opposite sides. That night, Heinrich wrote one of the longest entries in his notebook, describing the festival, the food, the conversations, the way men who should have been enemies had shared a meal and found common ground. He ended with a question he didn't know how to answer yet. What if we'd done this from the beginning? What if instead of fighting over resources, we'd focused on creating abundance to share? What if, instead of emphasizing differences, we'd celebrated what we have in common? What if food rather than force was how we measured power? These questions would stay with him for years, would inform everything he built after the war, would become the foundation of his philosophy as a baker and businessman and human being. But that night he just asked them, let them sit on the page. Unanswered but essential. The crack had become a canyon, and Heinrich was no longer falling. He was flying, learning to navigate this new world where enemies could become partners, where abundance was strategy, where feeding people well was the first step toward peace. The seed was taking root, deep in Texas soil, watered with sweat and tears and the slow transformation of men who'd come to war but found something else instead, something that would bloom years later in bakeries across Germany, in businesses that employed thousands, in techniques that fed millions. But the seed came from here, from a Texas POW camp, from American abundance shared without condition, from German pride yielding to wisdom, from a meal shared between enemies who were learning to see each other as human beings first. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that changed everything. Germany surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. At Camp Blanding, the Americans celebrated, whooping, cheering. Letters would go home announcing victory. Men would rotate back to civilian life. The machinery of war would begin winding down. The German prisoners sat in silence. Heinrich was in the bakery when he heard. 3 years at Camp Blanding, head chef for 2 of them. He'd built something here, a program, a system, relationships with American soldiers who'd become friends despite everything. And now it was ending. Franz found him an hour later still working, still baking bread because bread didn't care about politics or surrender or the end of wars. Dough rose, ovens baked, life continued. Germany lost, Franz said unnecessarily. Yes, Heinrich said. They stood together in the bakery, the mixers humming, the ovens radiating heat, the smell of bread that transcended nationality. What do we do now? Franz asked. We keep baking, Heinrich said, until they tell us to stop. Lieutenant Cooper came by that afternoon, found Heinrich and Franz and Klaus together, the three men who transformed Camp Blanding's kitchen over 3 years. I wanted to thank you, Cooper said, for everything. You made this place better. We learned more than we taught, Heinrich said. I doubt that Cooper said, but I appreciate you saying it. He handed Heinrich an envelope. Inside was a letter, written on official Army letterhead, addressed to whom it may concern. This letter certifies that Heinrich Adler served as head chef at Camp Blanding POW facility from March 1943 through May 1945. During this time, he demonstrated exceptional culinary skill, management ability, and leadership. He supervised operations feeding up to 2,500 personnel daily. He maintained the highest standards of quality, safety, and efficiency. He trained numerous American and German cooks in advanced techniques. He is highly recommended for any culinary position. Signed, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper, with Cooper's contact information at the bottom. You're giving me a reference, Heinrich asked, stunned. You earned it, Cooper said. The war's over. You'll need to build a life. This might help. He'd done the same for Franz and Klaus, for Otto and Dieter and 6 other German cooks who'd become part of his operation. Letters of recommendation from the enemy, for men who'd fought against America, because skills mattered more than sides, because the peace had to be built even while the war was ending. That evening, the German POWs gathered in the barracks. Speculation ran wild. When would they go home? What would they find? How long before repatriation? Heinrich pulled out his notebook. 212 pages now, equipment specifications, recipes, management systems, business economics, the complete blueprint for American institutional cooking. Franz had his own notes, Klaus had his, Otto, Dieter, others. Together, they documented everything they'd learned over 3 years. We're taking this home, Heinrich said to the group. We're going to rebuild. Use what we learned here. Create something new from the ruins. You think they'll listen, someone asked. To POWs, to men who surrendered. I think hungry people don't care where knowledge comes from, Heinrich said. They just want to eat, and we know how to feed people. Better than almost anyone left in Germany. The 5 core members, Heinrich, Franz, Klaus, Otto, Dieter, made a final pact. When they got home, wherever in Germany they ended up, they would implement what they'd learned. Open businesses, hire people, especially war widows and disabled veterans. Pay fair wages, treat employees with dignity, feed people well. American values in German businesses, creating abundance instead of hoarding scarcity. They didn't know if it would work, but they had to try. December 1945 came before repatriation began. 6 months of waiting, processing, paperwork, the slow machinery of peace grinding through details. During those months, Heinrich kept baking, kept teaching. American soldiers rotated home, but new ones arrived for discharge processing. German POWs waited. Life in limbo between war and whatever came next. Sergeant Hayes stopped by the bakery one morning. He'd been at Camp Blanding since Heinrich arrived. 3 years of working together. Friends now as much as captor and captive could be friends. I'm heading home next week, Hayes said. Chicago. Family's got a restaurant. I'll be working there. That's good, Heinrich said. You belong in a kitchen. So do you, Hayes said. He pulled out a piece of paper. My address. When you get settled in Germany, write me. Let me know how it's going. I will, Heinrich said. Hayes held out his hand. They shook. Then in a gesture that 3 years ago would have been impossible, they embraced. Brief, awkward, genuine. Thank you, Heinrich said. For everything, for treating us like human beings. You made it easy, Hayes said. You're good people, Heinrich. Don't forget that. April 1946. The announcement came. Repatriation would begin in May. German prisoners would be processed alphabetically. Heinrich's group would leave in late April. Suddenly it was real. Going home. After 3 years. Home to whatever was left. The night before departure, Captain Sullivan threw a final dinner. Not a festival this time. Just a meal. The Americans and Germans who'd worked together said goodbye over food as people had been doing since time began. Sullivan gave a speech, short, practical, like everything about the man. "You came here as enemies," Sullivan said. "You're leaving as friends. I don't know what that means for the future, but I know it means something. You've learned skills here. Use them, build something, feed people, create jobs, make your part of the world better." He paused. "The war is over," Sullivan continued. "The peace starts now. It starts with you, with what you do when you get home, with whether you choose to build or destroy, to create abundance or hoard scarcity." Heinrich knew he was talking to them, but he was also talking to his own men, the Americans who'd be going home to a changed world, who'd have to decide what kind of country they wanted to build. The meal ended. Men shook hands, exchanged addresses, made promises to write that most of them wouldn't keep, but some would. Heinrich found Cooper one last time. Sir Heinrich said, "I don't have words." "You don't need words," Cooper said. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Remember this. Remember that enemies can become friends, that abundance is better than scarcity, that feeding people well is the first step toward everything else. Take that home with you." "I promise," Heinrich said. April 27th, 1946, Port of New York. The transport ship waited at the dock. German prisoners boarding, going home. Heinrich stood in line with his small bag of belongings. Inside, his notebooks, Cooper's letter of recommendation, the photograph of Martha and Sophie, and the American commercial bakery catalog Sullivan had given him. Everything that mattered. Franz stood beside him, Klaus behind, Otto and Dieter further back. The five of them had stayed together through processing, would travel together to Hamburg, then scattered to different parts of Germany to rebuild their lives. The ship was crowded, hundreds of men, all going home, all uncertain what they'd find. Heinrich found a spot on deck as the ship pulled away from the dock, watched America shrink, the skyline, the Statue of Liberty, the whole impossible country that had transformed him. 3 years ago, he'd been a Nazi soldier, faithful to a cause built on hatred and superiority, certain of German destiny, convinced American chaos would collapse under pressure. He'd been wrong about everything. America wasn't chaotic. It was dynamically ordered. A different kind of system that served the many instead of the few. That valued abundance over scarcity. That treated people with dignity, regardless of rank or origin. And that system had broken him. Not with cruelty, but with kindness. Not with force, but with generosity. Fed him until the hatred dissolved. Taught him until the certainty cracked. Partnered with him until enemies became unnecessary. Franz appeared beside him at the rail. "Think it'll work?" Franz asked. "What we're planning, it has to," Heinrich said. "Germany needs to eat. We know how to feed people. That's a start." The crossing took 2 weeks. Men passed time playing cards, talking about home, wondering what they'd find. Heinrich spent the time reviewing his notebooks, memorizing details, preparing mentally for what came next. Building a business from nothing in a destroyed country with limited resources. But he'd learned something in America. You didn't need everything to start. You just needed enough. Enough flour, enough equipment, enough knowledge. Start small, build carefully, reinvest profits, grow. American business philosophy. Applied to German Reconstruction. May 15th, 1946. Hamburg Port. The ship docked. Men disembarked. Stepped onto German soil for the first time in years. The destruction was worse than they'd imagined. Hamburg was 70% rubble. Buildings collapsed. Streets impassable. Refugees everywhere. Food lines stretching blocks. "This is what we're working with," Klaus said quietly. "This is home." They stayed in Hamburg 3 days, processing through British occupation authorities, getting papers, permission to travel, the bureaucracy of reconstruction. Then they scattered. Klaus stayed in Hamburg, would look for work, eventually open a restaurant. Franz headed to Bavaria, Otto to Berlin, Dieter to Frankfurt. Heinrich took a train to Munich, or tried to. The rail system barely functioned. What should have taken 6 hours took 2 days. Stops, delays, destroyed tracks. May 18th, 1946. Munich. Heinrich stepped off the train into rubble. His city, the place he'd grown up, where he'd learned to bake, where he'd married Martha, where Sophie was born, 60% destroyed. More than half the buildings gone. The familiar streets unrecognizable. He walked to his old address near the Victualian Markt, the apartment building where his family had lived, where Martha and Sophie died in October 1940. Just rubble now, a crater, weeds growing in the spaces where lives used to be. But Heinrich had known this, had prepared himself. The past was gone. Only the future remained. He walked through the ruined market district, past collapsed buildings, past people living in basements because roofs no longer existed, past children begging, past women searching rubble for anything valuable. This was Germany. This was home. And this was what needed rebuilding. Heinrich rented a room in a building that still had most of its walls. 8 Deutsche Marks per month. Shared bathroom, no heat, but a roof and a door that locked. Then he started planning. The American bakery would open in 18 months. But first, Heinrich needed capital. Equipment, permits, 1,000 details. He found work at a collective bakery, making bread for ration cards. Terrible bread, barely edible, stretched with sawdust and substitutes because real flour was scarce. But he worked, saved money, made contacts, learned the post-war market, and every night he reviewed his American notebooks, reminded himself what was possible, what he was building toward. January 1948. Heinrich had saved 3,000 Deutsche Marks, enough to start. He found a bombed-out building, former bakery, roof mostly intact, ovens destroyed but repairable. The owner wanted to sell, too old to rebuild himself. Heinrich bought it for 2,000 marks, used the remaining 1,000 for basic repairs, fixed the roof, cleared the rubble, salvaged what equipment he could. Then he wrote to America, to Lieutenant Cooper, to Sergeant Hayes, to Captain Sullivan, asking for help getting equipment. American commercial ovens, a mixer, basic tools. Sullivan responded, helped arrange shipment through military surplus channels. Cooper sent updated catalogs. Hayes sent encouragement and a recipe for American bread his family restaurant used. The Americans hadn't forgotten. Even now, even after the war, they were investing in German reconstruction. The equipment arrived in March. Heinrich installed it himself, worked 16-hour days, got the ovens functioning. The mixer, operational, set up a simple production line. He hired 2 women, war widows, needed work. He taught them American techniques, precision, consistency, quality control. American Bakery opened in Munich on May 1st, 1948, 3 years to the day after Germany surrendered. The first day, Heinrich produced 80 loaves, not much, but they were good, consistent. Every loaf identical. He sold them for 20 pfennigs each, cheaper than other bakeries because his efficiency allowed lower prices. 12 customers that first day. Neighborhood people, skeptical of American methods. But the bread was good. They came back. Week 2 production increased to 120 loaves. Customers multiplied. Word spread. Adler's bread never varies. You can trust it. By month 3, Heinrich was producing 300 loaves daily, hired another worker, a disabled veteran who'd lost his left hand. Heinrich adapted processes so he could work one-handed. Productivity over pity, dignity through employment. Month 6, 500 loaves daily. Lines forming before opening. Heinrich opened a small cafe section. Customers could eat on site. Free coffee refills, American style. The refills shocked people. Free coffee, multiple cups, that's wasteful. But it worked. People stayed longer, bought more bread to take home, brought friends. The cafe became a gathering place. December 1948, first full year results. Revenue 45,000 Deutsche Marks, profit 12,000. Heinrich reinvested everything. New equipment, better ovens, expanded workspace, hired 6 more workers. All war widows or disabled veterans. People who needed opportunity. Heinrich needed productive employees. Match made through necessity. He paid 15% above market wages. Could afford to because of efficiency. His workers stayed, became skilled. Productivity increased. January 1949. Franz visited from Bavaria. His bakery was producing 400 loaves daily, revenue 40,000 marks annually. They compared notes, shared techniques, updated each other on their versions of the American manual. Klaus sent a letter from Hamburg. His hotel restaurant was feeding 500 people daily, using American efficiency with German quality, thriving. Otto reported from Berlin, largest bakery in the city now, 2,000 loaves daily, 34 employees. Dieter had become a food distributor, supplied all four of their businesses plus 23 others. Revenue approaching 200,000 marks annually. The network was growing, former POWs implementing American methods, creating jobs, feeding people, building the peace they'd learned about in Texas, June 1950. The reunion, 5 men gathered in Munich: Heinrich, Franz, Klaus, Otto, Dieter. The core group, the ones who'd made the pact under Texas stars 7 years ago. They met at American Bakery, now expanded to employ 12 people full-time. The statistics they shared were remarkable. Combined, their businesses employed over 200 people, generated more than 300,000 Deutschmarks in annual revenue, fed tens of thousands daily. But the numbers weren't the point. The point was the philosophy. Treat employees well, pay fair wages, create abundance. Feed people with dignity. American values in German businesses, rebuilding not just buildings but society itself. They raised glasses of beer, real beer, not ersatz. Germany was recovering. To the Americans who showed us a better way, Heinrich said. To the ones who refused to see us as just enemies, Klaus added. To Lieutenant Cooper and Sergeant Hayes and Captain Sullivan, Franz said. To the idea that food can build peace, Otto said. To America and Germany, Dieter said. Both. They drank. Then they got to work planning the next phase. Expansion, more locations, more more impact. The seed planted in Texas was blooming in Munich, in Bavaria, in Hamburg, in Berlin, and Frankfurt. Across Germany, former POWs who'd learned American abundance were creating it in their homeland. Not copying blindly, adapting, taking American efficiency and German quality, creating something new, something hybrid, something that worked. The Americans had invested in knowledge. That investment was paying dividends they'd never see. Jobs created, families fed, a country rebuilt one bakery at a time. But the payoff wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. A generation of Germans who'd learned that abundance was better than scarcity, that cooperation beat domination, that feeding people well was the foundation of everything else. Those lessons would spread, would influence German business culture for decades, would help create the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, all from a simple decision to feed prisoners well, to teach instead of punish, to invest in peace before the war even ended. September 1963. Heinrich Adler, now 57 years old, stepped off an airplane at Love Field in Dallas, Texas. His first time back in America since 1946. First time back in Texas since leaving Camp Blanding 17 years ago. He was here for a reunion. Camp Blanding was closing, being decommissioned. The Army was gathering former personnel, both American and German, for a final ceremony. Elizabeth, his wife, since 1951, traveled with him. She was a teacher, patient, kind, different from Martha, but filling a space Heinrich had thought would stay empty forever. The ceremony was in the town near the old camp. The mayor presented Heinrich with a key to the city. For contributions to German-American friendship, the citation read, Heinrich gave a speech, halting English, but good enough. In 1943, I arrived here as enemy, hungry, angry, convinced of my superiority. You gave me 3 things: food, dignity, knowledge. The food fed my body, the dignity fed my soul, the knowledge fed my future. And Germany's future. He paused, emotion thick in his throat. 20 years later, my businesses employ 127 people. My colleagues employ thousands more. We feed hundreds of thousands. And every single day I remember the first egg, the first bacon, the first time an American general said thank you to a German prisoner. Another pause. The crowd was silent. You didn't just win the war with bombs, you won the peace with butter and bread and kindness. He sat down to applause. Lieutenant Cooper was there, retired now, civilian clothes, They embraced like the old friends they were. But you did it, Cooper said. You built what we talked about. No, Heinrich said. We built it. Your lessons, my hands. Sergeant Hayes came from Chicago, older, grayer, but still the same practical man Heinrich remembered. They spent an hour catching up. Hayes's family restaurant in Chicago, Heinrich's bakery in Munich. 18 years of life condensed into conversation. Captain Sullivan was there too, 81 now, frail but sharp. He pulled Heinrich aside. I knew you'd make something of yourself, Sullivan said. Could see it in how you worked, how you treated people. You taught me how to lead, Heinrich said, how to build teams, how to create something bigger than myself. I just showed you what was already there, Sullivan said. That evening, the reunion dinner. Americans and Germans who'd worked together at Camp Blanding. 40 people, ages ranging from 45 to 81, all connected by 3 years in a Texas POW camp. The meal was German food, sauerbraten and spätzle, Black Forest cake, prepared by local caterers using recipes Heinrich had provided. Full circle, German food in Texas, cooked for Americans and Germans gathered in peace. Heinrich stood to make a final toast. The greatest generation, he began, and Americans nodded, recognizing the phrase, understood something we sometimes forget. Yesterday's enemy can be tomorrow's friend. Yesterday's war can become tomorrow's peace, but only if we choose to see people, not just sides. He raised his glass. To those who fought with honor, to those who made peace with wisdom, to those who understand that the strongest victory is the one that turns foes into friends. They drank. The party wound down around midnight. Men exchanged addresses, made promises to stay in touch. Some would, most wouldn't, but the connection existed, would always exist. Heinrich and Elizabeth walked back to their hotel. The Texas night was warm, stars overhead, the same stars he'd watched from the barracks window 20 years ago. Different man, different life, same stars. You're quiet, Elizabeth said. Just thinking, Heinrich replied, about how much has changed, about how I came here hating America, left loving what it taught me. What did it teach you? Elizabeth asked. That generosity defeats propaganda, that abundance shared builds more than abundance hoarded, that the simple act of feeding someone with dignity can change the world. They walked in silence for a while. The Americans who ran those POW camps, Heinrich said, weren't trying to create an economic miracle. They were just following their values. Every person deserves respect. Every worker deserves fair treatment. Every human deserves a full stomach. And those values he continued taught through food and kindness rebuilt a nation. Reminded us that America's greatest strength has never been its weapons. It's been its heart. They reached the hotel. Heinrich looked back toward where Camp Blanding had been. Closed now, empty, being reclaimed by Texas prairie. But what happened there would never be empty, would live in businesses across Germany, in jobs created, in people fed, in a philosophy of abundance that spread like seeds on the wind. May 1978. Heinrich Adler passed away at age 72. Heart attack, quick, peaceful. His funeral in Munich was attended by 300 people, employees, business partners, community members. The mayor gave a eulogy. American Bakery continued operating under management he'd trained, would continue for decades more. Franz, Klaus, Otto, and Dieter all attended. The 4 survivors of the original 5, old men now, but still connected by what they'd built. At the reception, they gathered privately, shared memories, laughed about the early days, cried for their lost friend. We should write this down, Otto said. The whole story, what happened at Camp Blanding, what we learned, what we built. It's in the notebooks, Klaus said. Heinrich kept everything. Not the facts, Otto clarified, the meaning, the transformation, how food and kindness changed us from enemies to builders. Franz nodded slowly. Future generations should know, should understand that peace is possible, that enemies can become brothers, that it starts with simple things, like a shared meal. They never did write it down formally, but they told the story to children and grandchildren, to journalists occasionally interested in the human side of history, to anyone who'd listen, and the story spread. Not widely, not famously, but persistently. The tale of German POWs who learned American abundance in Texas and brought it home to rebuild their country, a footnote in history books, if mentioned at all. But to the thousands who worked in those businesses, to the hundreds of thousands who ate food produced with dignity and efficiency, to the small corner of Germany that was rebuilt by men who'd learned to see enemies as teachers, to them, it wasn't a footnote, it was everything. The American bakery still operates in Munich, different owners now, but the philosophy remains: consistency, quality, fair wages, dignity through employment. The building has a small plaque, placed in 1998, 50th anniversary of opening, founded by Heinrich Adler, 1948, former prisoner of war who learned that yesterday's enemy can become tomorrow's friend. That abundance is better than scarcity, that feeding people well is the first step toward peace. Tourists sometimes photograph it, wonder about the story. Most don't pursue it, just another old bakery in a city full of history. But for those who know, who understand what happened in Texas between 1943 and 46, the plaque represents something profound. It represents the possibility of transformation, the power of generosity, the simple truth that how you treat people matters more than the side they fought on. It represents the seed planted under Texas stars, watered with American abundance, grown into German businesses that fed a generation. Most of all, it represents hope. Hope that wars end, that enemies reconcile, that people who've killed each other can sit down together and share a meal. That peace, real peace, is built one breakfast at a time, one act of dignity at a time, one choice to build instead of destroy. The story ends where it began, with food, with kindness, with the radical idea that every person, regardless of rank or race or history, deserves to eat well. Heinrich Adler came to America a Nazi soldier, convinced of German superiority, certain the chaotic Americans would collapse. He returned understanding that true strength lies in abundance shared with all, that the Americans didn't just teach him to bake differently, they showed him a different world was possible. And he spent the rest of his life building that world, one loaf at a time, loaf at a